This is the literary lecture in the Theodicy section of the Reforming Wisdom class. Luther told his students that the angels had been sent to warn Sodom prior to their destruction as a lesson in trusting God's goodness to defend his people in the midst of apocalyptic warfare. The apocalypse, or end times, the tearing of the veil between the worlds, was not such a strange place for Luther to believe that the world was in. The Ottoman Empire was approaching, if not having actually already sacked Vienna, moving as far west as they ever have, and threatening all of Christendom. The Roman Pope was deliberately, in Luther's eyes, not listening to the gospel and the Holy Spirit. Those things, plus the fantastic temptations that people were facing. Remember that this is at the beginning of the Age of Enlightenment. The Reformation is followed very quickly by the Scientific Revolution. Suddenly, everything is being called into question. This would seem very much like the end times. In fact, there are a lot of parallels to our life now, in which so many things are changing so quickly, we spend most of our time trying to catch up as opposed to be ahead of these changes. Luther was very much living in a time that felt like the end times. It was not just on the theological, national, or international scales that we were under attack. For Luther, he felt that fanatical spirits and Satan were attacking souls, seizing them and holding them captive. This is very much a part of the language that he uses. Are we drawn into the darkness? Are we taken by that monster into the mouth of hell, against our will and in spite our best efforts? This is very much the mindset and the language that he used to communicate his theology, as it was different from that of the Catholic Church. In the last lecture, I asked you to consider whether or not violence upon another was limited to humans. Luther specifically directed his students to ponder the course of nature. He wanted them to notice that more good occurs than bad, because part of the apocalyptic mindset was that Luther was looking beyond the veil between the worlds. Luther was looking at the world to come. He was very specific in how that world would proceed into our lives, and that was through the cross. So in pondering the course of nature, we will notice that the sunshine and the clean air and the birds on wing very much outweigh when we see an animal that has been killed or an oil slick. There is more good to be seen in the world than bad. It does not change that there is bad in the world, but looking at the world to come changes the lens through which we view it. When you look at this picture, are you noticing that most of the world is in darkness? Or are you looking at the bright spots and noticing the parts of the world that are in light? This is very much how Luther looked at the world, and we are in that space where the darkness and the light are both present. We don't classify Genesis as a whole as a book of apocalyptic literature, but there are parts of Genesis, there are stories within Genesis that definitely fall within this genre. Apocalyptic literature has a distinctive quality to it that's almost mystical. This is where the magic that we see, the absolutely miraculous events, tend to be in literature that has this apocalyptic quality. Apocalyptic literature tends to describe both a past and a present, but is pretty vague in terms of the future. The present is usually quite dark, and the future light or the past light. It's very dualistic. They lend themselves to heavily coded messages and tend to be surreal and fantastic. And in this case, we have angels and fire from heaven in a way that do not enter into our everyday life. Is living an experience that is an apocalyptic struggle between good and evil, meaning we know our past and we live in our present, but we can only imagine the future. And is this a means of communicating the knowledge and wisdom of God? Is apocalyptic literature stuck where it is in linear time, an entire way of us to be thinking of God? And how does that address our question of the existence of evil? Looked at simply, the story of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah is structured to show the tension between the faith of Abraham and the waywardness of humanity. It is done in a bolder, larger-than-life, almost cartoonish way. But it is a way that illustrates that tension of the in-between. It might not look like it at first glance, but Walter Brueggemann suggests that this story is a bold pastoral resource for valuing a human vocation. What does that mean? That means that instead of concentrating on the evil that is in Sodom and Gomorrah, on the acts of the humans that are violent and wrong, or on the fire raining down from heaven, we focus on the fact that love wins. God's love for Abraham, Lot's love for his family. There is a future built in love here. Lot does not know what the next chapter of his family's life is going to be. And in this evil, he loses his wife. And yet, they continue and they build a future with the evil behind them. Brueggemann continues, "It is easy enough to grow cynical and imagine that nothing matters anyway, because evil is too overwhelming. It is equally easy to grow selfish, as if there was some private well-being available to us. Left out of this statement is the hard part, is knowing that God's goodness and defense of his people in the midst of apocalyptic warfare may be what bridges our experience on an evil earth or a violent earth with the overwhelming loving kindness of the Lord." The biblical text refutes both the fact that evil is too overwhelming or the fact that there is private well-being available to us, works that we can accomplish to save ourselves. This text refutes both. The text of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah has all of the saving action in God's hands. What if our human vocation, our purpose, is to bridge these extremes between cynicism and the selectivism of being our own works that save us, that select theology that limits how it is done and takes the action power away from God? What if that's our vocation? is living in this experienced struggle between good and evil a means of communicating, or does it give us the vocabulary to communicate with so that we can talk about God, the knowledge of God, and God's wisdom? And in some ways, this may be one of the hardest ones. How do we take terrible stories like this and share them with others to talk about the loving kindness of God without trying to reduce the pain and the suffering that occurs in it?